Now, we all know that plants need at least a little sunlight in order to germinate, establish, grow, and reproduce. But some plants need a lot of light, so-called sun plants, while others get by in the shade, so-called shade plants, using a variety of strategies. And some plants can adjust to changing conditions that cause them to be shaded one day and out in the open in the next, as when a tree falls in a forest. Did you hear it? Some plants rely on disturbances, such as fire, that keep a closed canopy from establishing. Plants have a particular suite of receptor chemicals, the phytochromes, which are highly sensitive to light, particularly the red end of the light spectrum. Phytochromes can stimulate a seed buried in the soil of the forest floor to germinate upon exposure to even a minute sunfleck. They do this by stimulating the production of certain hormones, like gibberellin, auxin, and cytokinin, which in turn regulate genes that control elongation of the seedling stem, and the production of its first leaves and how those leaves are deployed to capture more sunlight. But for our purposes here, we'll focus less on the biochemistry of plant life and consider instead some of the wily ways plants have of harvesting light and outcompeting their neighbors. Let's start at the forest floor, which is typically a darkish place, especially under a canopy of conifers such as hemlocks. Plants growing in deep shade have very different leaves from those of plants, even of the same species, that are growing in sun. In fact, you may even notice some of these differences on a single plant, between leaves at the top of the plant and those at lower levels, which are shaded by the upper leaves. Shade leaves tend to be larger in surface area than sun leaves. They're spreading their tissues out to maximize the area of the leaf exposed to sun. Even the upper leaves of full-grown trees, such as oaks, may be more lobed and smaller than the lower leaves. So here are two leaves from a rhododendron growing in my backyard. Which one grew at the sunnier position on this shrub? Lower, more shaded leaves also tend to hold themselves more horizontally than upper, sun-exposed leaves. Here are two views of my mountain fetterbush, Pieris floribunda. The top leaves are angled downward, whereas the bottom leaves are spread out to increase the surface area able to capture light. The upper leaves may be actually avoiding direct sun and wind exposure, and we'll talk about the effects of too much sun a bit later. If you stroll through a forest understory, you might notice that many species of forest shrubs tend to have an overall growth form, or architecture, that naturally arrays their leaves and branches horizontally. Take a look at flowering dogwood, Benthamidea florida, or witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana, and notice their layered growth form that minimizes self-shading and maximizes sun gathering. You may even have noticed poison ivy doing this. Leaves even change their internal anatomy to capture light. Looking at these cross-sections of leaves of lamb's quarters, Chenopodium album, you'll notice that shade leaves are thinner than sun leaves and array their internal cells a bit willy-nilly compared to the orderly array of cells in sun leaves. Why do they do this? Well, a thinner leaf can funnel light energy more efficiently to the internal tissues. Also, the more seemingly random arrangement of the internal cells causes light to bounce around inside the leaf, increasing the chances that light energy will actually make it to the photosynthetic tissues, the mesophyll, where the active chloroplasts reside and do their stuff with photosynthesis. Some plants of the forest understory are actually pretty shade intolerant. Examples include our beloved spring ephemerals, including bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis, Dutchman's breeches, and many others. These plants get their sunlight exceptionally early in the spring, before the trees and shrubs above them leaf out. They're called ephemerals because they must complete their life cycles during the short window when sunlight is available to them. Unfortunately, some invasive shrubs, such as honeysuckles, a species in the genus Lonicera, also tend to leaf out earlier now, even 11 days earlier than native shrubs or trees. And these may both shade out ephemeral herbs and outcompete them for nutrients that are being released from a warming soil layer. Incidentally, red light isn't the only wavelength that signals plant activity. Closer to another end of the spectrum is blue light, which wakes plants up in the morning. Sunrise is enriched in blue light. And also ultraviolet light, which certain alpine plants, such as Dryas octopetala, use as a signal to help their flowers track the sun. As their flowers orient toward the position of the sun each day, they warm up and provide a cozy place for pollinators to visit. Such a reward is essential during the brief, cold Arctic summer. Now, we don't have Dryas species anymore in New England, as they've migrated further north, but these nitrogen-fixing plants were essential to repopulating our landscape with plants following deglaciation. Now let's look at the other side of the coin, how plants cope with too much light. If you've ever noticed winter burn on your rhododendrons, you're seeing the effect of an overdose of direct sunlight, which is exacerbated by cold, desiccating winds. This overdose is called photoinhibition. Light particles, photons, enter the photosystems of green cells to kickstart the first step in the reaction chain that will release oxygen and water and the energy to fuel reactions down the line. But excess energy bouncing around in cells can lead to the production of oxygen radicals, which can damage the photosystems. Now, any of us who have consumed pomegranates, or kale, as valuable so-called antioxidants know what too many free radicals in our cells can do. So plants deal with excess light energy literally by juggling it around, passing it along to special protective pigment molecules called carotenoids. Think the beta-carotene in carrots. These carotenoids change their chemical configuration when they're struck, like a lightning rod, and in so doing dissipate the excess energy. It's a bit like playing hot potato, which, considering these are plants. Plants also use sunscreen. These bright red Salicornia plants may look as though they're sunburned, but they're using a different class of protective pigments called anthocyanins to protect against photoinhibition. And Salicornia sure grows in a stressful place, salt marsh, with overabundant natural light. These pigments look red to our eyes because they're absorbing light wavelengths on the high energy end of the spectrum, from green to violet. What's left in the spectrum for them to reflect to our eyes is red. So anthocyanins are the pigments left over when chlorophyll breaks down in autumn leaves, which is why they appear red and orange to us. Much earlier in the year, anthocyanins can protect newly emerging tender leaves from too much light, such as on this dogwood. Many plants absolutely revel in bright sunlight. We encountered some of them in the sand plains we highlighted last week. These plants require regular disturbance, such as fire, that helps to wipe out the competition from canopy trees, such as pitch pine, Pinus frigida. These disturbances reset the successional clock, as it were, making sunshine available to the grasses, herbs, and small shrubs that have adapted to high light. Fire, of course, also stimulates seed germination of pitch pine, whose cones are physically pried open by heat and whose seeds may be stimulated to germinate by the chemicals in smoke. So it's a double-edged sword, being disturbance-dependent. Other disturbance-dependent systems include floodplains and ice-scoured shores and islands of rivers. Throughout our forests, there are hosts of understory species that sit by, subsist ably, and await their day in the sun. Sometimes that opportunity comes by a single tree falling to open up a gap in the overstory. Other times, it may happen catastrophically, occasioned by a major hurricane, a tornado, a downburst that, within minutes or hours, razes the canopy. The Great Hurricane of 1938 reshaped our forests dramatically. Venture out on any trail and you may see that most of the trees you encounter are medium-sized, maybe 10 to 15 inches in diameter. These trees are younger than the cohort that would have come back following the abandonment of agriculture in the late 1800s. They likely recruited in when the 1938 hurricane felled great swaths of forest in central New England. More recently, Cathedral pines, an old-growth forest in northwestern Connecticut, was devastated by tornadoes in July 1989. The Nature Conservancy, which owned and protected the land, made the difficult decision to leave much of the damage untouched, except for removing some of the dangerously teetering trees that could have injured someone. Today, that site is a living laboratory that helps us better understand how the remaining ancient trees survive as a new generation of trees and other plants rejuvenates the forest. Close to my home, a microburst raked the flank of Mount Tom in East Hampton, Massachusetts in October 2014. This tableau is a tattered remnant of the dense forest that once cloaked these slopes. But already I can see seedlings and saplings taking advantage of the new light. Disturbance is part and parcel of the ecology of every region on Earth. Change is the stuff of renewal and of evolution. Next week, we'll ponder on the future of the New England flora, how our species will respond to changing land use and climate, and how Homo sapiens as a species can continue to foster resilience in the plant kingdom.